Hello and welcome to the Organic Gardening Podcast. I'm Sarah Brown and I'm joined by Chris Collins. We both work here at Garden Organic, helping you on your organic growing journey. Each month we like to bring you some gardening tips, whether like me you have a garden or like Chris you live in a city and grow on a balcony or an allotment. And we're always joined by an interesting guest whose life is shaped by gardening and particularly organic growing. Our podcast is sponsored by the Organic Gardening Catalogue. Chris and I love this online shop. You can find nearly everything you might need to support your organic growing. And if you're a member of Garden Organic, you get 10% off everything. So just go to www.organiccatalogue.com. Now, what have we got for you this month? Chris and I will be discussing February jobs for those lovely wintry days when it's not too cold or wet to go outside. And our post-bag queries cover how to clear an allotment, protecting plants from frost, what to do with your old brassica stumps. I even got to sneak in a question of my own. What am I going to do with all the moss which is all over my paths? We find the organic answer to them all. Our interview this month is with Ben Raskin from the Soil Association. He's talking about the hot topic of agroforestry, why and how to mix trees in with your planting. I think you'll love it. So wherever you're listening, if you're running, sitting in the car or busy in the potting shed, I hope you enjoy this month's chat and you feel inspired to get growing the organic way. Chris, how nice to see you.
And you, Sarah, and looking well.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same to you.
Yeah, we're doing all right. We're gardeners, aren't we? We always look well.
Well, that's true. And I guess we're out of doors a lot as well, whatever the weather is.
Rosy cheeks, girl, rosy
Let's
cheeks.
face it, February can bring some pretty dire weather, can't it?
It certainly can. And I think also post-Christmas people tend to be in the blues. I notice it certainly living in London now. I think maybe too much has gone on the credit card and, all that's happened. For me, I come in defence of winter. I actually think it's a very underrated season, a very beautiful season. I walk a lot, and I'd walk around Enfield, a place called Trent Park on the edge of London, and really the trees just look amazing this time. A big oak in a field, silhouetted against a low winter sun, just stops you in your tracks, Sarah. Trees really engage me this time of year. I always call it, they're in the all together. They're not clothed,
Well,
there's no
you're seeing
leaves.
their structure.
You are, like
beautiful.
frozen wooden fountains, something like that, just absolutely stunning. It's also a brilliant time of year to learn your trees because buds is a really good way to identify them. Tree shape is a really good identifier. So it's a really good way if you're interested in trees to learn them. This is the time of year to do it. But those low winter, wintry suns, you get the beams of light through them. I just think it's so, so beautiful.
Do you know, I agree with you. That winter light, sometimes the grey sky looks like a pigeon's breast. It's so beautiful. But I also notice that the days are getting longer. I'm also noticing that there are shoots of crocuses, of snowdrops, daffodils. All these things are giving us hope, aren't they?
They are. You're always in that sense, I think February is an interesting month. Spring's not far away. The growing season's not far away. So you kind of appreciate the beauty of winter, but the anticipation of the spring starts to set in.
And I guess if you live further north, it's still very cold and very bleak compared to London, which
certainly
has its own little micro.
Well, I've lived in Edinburgh for those years when I studied up there. I'm an absolute genius at getting dressed under a duvet in 30 seconds because, it's still cold at this time of year. But then again, you go to Peebles, the Borders, and Doyek Botanic Garden, I'll mention. The most incredible winter skies. I've never seen anything like it. That's the way I look at it.
It's the beauty, isn't it, that gets us.
Yeah.
So, winter jobs. Okay, my first one, which I've been doing over the past few weekends, is winter pruning. I have 3 large climbing roses which go up the front and the back of my house. So I've been up a ladder, cutting those right back to growth buds. Wisteria, honeysuckle. I spent last weekend tackling a very overgrown hawthorn hedge, for instance.
Yeah.
These are all things that can be done if you wrap up warm, put on top.
Get the long johns on.
Absolutely. And boy, do you feel satisfied when you've done it. But now is the perfect time to do it.
It is. I'll be looking at all pruning, especially say fruit trees, wisterias. I'll prune my vine. I'll spur prune a lot of stuff this time of year. I think that's the time of year because you can see the shape because there's no foliage on them. You can see what you're doing. And it's easy, right? Incredibly satisfying.
And if you're not confident about where to cut, you can look it up online. There's all sorts of sources. But basically, you're going down to a strong, healthy bud, which may just be a little slit in the side of the stem. It's not necessarily a bud that's shooting out. Depends on the plant. But cut down close to that bud, and you'll be fine.
I would. That's right. The word we're looking for is node. You're looking for a node,
exactly,
right? That's it. And then I usually go down. Say if I was pruning an apple tree, I'd probably go down to 2 nodes from the main branch or a rose. Always do an outward facing on a rose as well, so you're not getting any crossing or rubbing wood. It's very, very beautiful. Very peaceful thing to be doing this time of year.
And of course, Chris, now is the perfect time to create a pond, isn't it? And
yes.
I've been saying this all winter, I'm going to dig my pond.
You've been threatening to a pond for a while now.
it's just having the muscle power to do the digging,
yes,
I reckon.
Yeah.
But you did a very helpful video on YouTube, didn't you, on how to dig a pond, how to create a pond.
It's on our website, isn't it, on the www.gardenorganic.org.uk, and it is very simple. It's actually cost effective, it's very cheap to do. You need a butyl liner, some sand to stop it getting punctured, and your mussels are spayed and some mussels and you're away. And of course, there's nothing more beneficial to wildlife than a little water aquatic area.
It doesn't have to be big, I keep saying to myself. And of course, now is the perfect time, because if I can get it done now, it'll be in time for the frogs and the toads to come and lay their
I
spawn.
think, as it's February, any sort of landscaping jobs you've got, this is your last chance, really. So if you want to maybe move around a little, some slabs or put in a new path or those kind of structural jobs, this is what I'm doing now this time of year on my allotment. I'm redoing all the borders for my raised beds so I can no dig. All those kind of little constructive jobs I'm doing at the moment.
That's very good thinking, because the garden looks quite naked at the moment, doesn't it? So that allows you to envisage the bone structure of it. That kind of brings me on to the fact that February is also a good month for planning your planting. Thinking about what you want to grow and where you want it to grow. Do you want to move some plants? Do you want to divide your plants? And then also where you're going to grow your veg.
Yes.
I'm a great believer in moving your veg around. I have raised beds and I make sure that I grow different vegetables in each different
So you're
bed.
rotating to maximise the use of your soil.
The phrase is crop rotation, but it's done for 2 reasons, I think. One is mainly because you're preventing a build-up of disease. Say, like I had allium leaf miner, devastated my leeks last autumn.
Yeah.
I will not be growing leeks in that bed again, possibly for some years.
Yeah.
It would be a mistake to put them back in. But the other thing that moving your plants around is that when you treat your soil for your hungry veg, and by hungry veg I mean things like potatoes and brassicas, they like a good dose of compost before you plant them. If you've got just one compost heap and quite a restricted supply of compost, use it for those hungry plants. Then in the other areas you can plant the not so hungry plants like carrots, peas and beans, other root vegetables, because they will be quite happy in the soil that was composted last year. It sounds complicated, but all you have to remember is where you planted things last year and then move everything around.
Yes, move them on one. It's a very important part. You're right, otherwise you do get pathogen build-up. And also you can take advantage of things like legumes. You can dig them straight into the soil and they'll provide quite a lot of fertiliser for that patch, and then you can bring plants in on top of it. It's very, very important part of veg growing rotation, I would argue.
Yeah, and you also presumably are doing something similar on your balcony, are you?
I am indeed. Well, this time of year for me, it's like all gardeners, good ones, always think ahead. My mind is always in front of myself when it comes to gardening, because I want to get excited about the season ahead. And I do like to sit there with catalogues. I do like to sit and look at stuff. And there's all these plants coming my way. And,
so tempting, isn't it?
It is. You've got to keep the lid on it a bit. You've got to set yourself a budget. That's the idea, Sarah, I think. But it's really nice to get excited about the year ahead. I think that's a big part of being a gardener. And I don't think many other subject matters you have that. I don't think you do. I think it's very unique to us. So embrace it, I say. And don't look out the window at Easter and bank holiday weekend and think, oh, I've got a garden. Make sure you build up. Make sure it's an enjoyable experience.
So you can use this relatively quiet month for planning.
Yes.
Feel that sap rising within you.
Yes, exactly.
You know what's ahead of you.
Yeah, exactly.
But just plan what you can plant. I think they're so seductive, those catalogues, and I look at something and I think, oh yes, I'll have something bright blue in that corner. Think about your soil, think about the position where the plant's going to go. Is it sunny? Is it shady? Have you got acid? Have you got lime soil? That sort of thing.
A bit of homework. It doesn't take a long time, and also that means you've engaged that plant already before you've even put it in the ground. You've already got a stake. You've already got skin in the game with that plant. You know, and for me, the big thing I think about is obviously space. Just make sure you've got the space.
Great.
Don't forget your house plants. I've been doing a lot of work on my house plants at the moment. I have an extensive collection. You can have a couple or you can have lots. But I'm now potting those on ready for the season ahead. So I've got quite big ficus, Benjaminus ficus, elastica, like rubber plants, weeping figs. I've got things like Chef Lira. They're all quite big plants. I'm putting them into new pots. not massive pots, but I'm just moving them up a few inches, a few centimetres. And at the same time, I will sprinkle a little bit of slow release comfrey pellet, Bocking 14, on Mr. Hills, who discovered it. I swear by them, I use them on balcony. I put a little spread through them. That means they'll feed my houseplants throughout the summer. And really, that's job done. I water quite freely through the summer. I'm hardly watering at all in the winter. They're potted up, ready to go for the spring.
I haven't started sowing yet, and I won't until March. So
Me
I think
neither.
we'll
Me too.
leave that one for this month and hit the ground running in March.
Yep, that sounds good.
And is there anything else? I think a little tip, keep off your wet and frozen soil if you can. If you tread on it, you'll just flatten it and you'll compact it.
Yes, you're going to end up with drainage problems. You are destroying the soil structure if you're treading on wet, frosted ground. There's no need to be doing it. If you really have to go on, just throw down a board, spread your weight on it, and that will cause less damage.
And one final thing, if you're really bored and cold, turn your compost heap.
Yes, yeah.
It just helps to aerate it, which helps the whole lot to rot down, ready for you to use in the growing months.
I love the heat that comes out of it when you move it, I really do. A little bit of caution maybe, just nice and gently turn it in case there's any slow worms or anything in there, because I do get those on my allotment site. So I turn it, but I actually do it. I can get in there with my hands quite happily, to be honest with you. I don't need a tool for it. I can come home rather smelly, much to the disgust of my good lady wife, I can tell you.
Each to their own.
Yeah, I'm rolling in my newly turned over soil and I can't help myself.
So February needn't be gloomy. Let's enjoy it and relish it and get excited about what's coming ahead.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Chris. This year, more than ever, we're conscious of the climate emergency, and one of the solutions to reduce carbon emissions is to plant trees, lots of them. We thought it would be interesting to hear about how trees can be grown across the land by farmers and growers, even gardeners. Not to replace crops, but to be mixed in with them. Chris spent time with one of the experts in this area, Ben Raskin from the Soil Association. Ben has worked across the country, from Wales to Kent, Oxfordshire, and now he's currently working and researching at Eastbrook Farm in Wiltshire. Chris joined him there, and they settled down to chat in a large barn.
Well, hi Ben. Thanks so much for inviting me up to Eastbrook Farm. We have had a little tour to look at the agroforestry going on here. A lot of people probably not heard of agroforestry. It's not very common, is it? It's been around a long time. Maybe just describe to us what agroforestry really is, what you're trying to achieve with it.
So in its most basic sense, it's the deliberate integration of trees and farming. So rather than having your field of cows or your field of wheat, and then your woodland somewhere else, you're actually mixing those up, mixing the trees and the farm enterprises, but doing it consciously and managing both aspects of them.
Right.
It's serving a proper function in a way, and a deliberate thought about function within the farm.
And I suppose so it's diversity is the key in a little way, and so you're mixing everything together. That has quite a lot of organic traits then, doesn't it?
Yes, organic farming has always been much more mixed than some of the kind of the more intensive farms that have developed recently. Organic farming relies on a rotation, usually with animals, not always. And the bringing trees in is, as you say, it adds to that diversity and complexity. And we know that diverse systems are more resilient, we know they're more productive. So actually, if you can successfully bring trees in, it should help.
So let's think, if I was one of the listeners, how do we picture this? So you mentioned trees, you mentioned fruit, ground cover, animals. Yeah. So what would be a typical sort of plot then, would you think?
Well, I'm not sure there is a typical plot.
Right.
And one of the challenges, in a way, when you start thinking about what you might do, either on a farm, but even if you're thinking about doing something similar in the garden, is, what tree do I plant? There's so many trees I could choose, and how does that fit with a whole range of enterprise? So very quickly you get into an almost infinite number of possibilities. So rather than kind of thinking perhaps of a typical system, we're trialling a few different systems, I guess, on the farm, which one of them is going to be a chicken and tree enterprise. So the idea there is that, chickens are woodland or woodland edge birds. They like being under trees. It makes them feel happy. They get the shelter in the shade. So we've just been walking around in the rain, feeling a bit cold. Actually, it'd been quite nice to be sheltered under a tree. Animals feel the same. They don't like being out in the middle of the field in the scorching sun.
They feel exposed, I suppose.
Driving rain, and they're most of them are prey animals. So is a bird going to come and get them? Is someone going to eat them? So they like that protection of trees. And one of the big things is actually around temperature. So if you're sheltered by trees, the air temperature can be 4 or 5 degrees higher. And if you're not spending all that energy keeping warm, you can put that energy into something else. Is it laying eggs or milk or whatever your farm and production system is? That energy can be used for being productive rather than just keeping warm.
So the trees are making happy chickens, basically.
Exactly.
So you're cropping the trees of nuts, fruits, and you get the eggs and the chicken itself.
Yeah.
So you're combining those two ecosystems in a way, those two forms of life together.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
And they're usually 30 or 40% more productive overall.
Wow,
So
that's a big percentage.
It is,
Yeah.
and you're if you think to get 30% more yield from just one crop would be really hard. You'd have to put probably a lot of extra fertilizer. You'd have to spend a lot more time weeding it or whatever it is. But actually, just by planting the trees, you can get a similar overall productivity.
Wow, that is a high percentage. I'm shocked actually how.
It can be more. There's quite an interesting case study which a chap called David Brass, who's a free-range egg producer, and he's one of the McDonald's sustainable producers. So he's big egg producer, and he did a trial with 33 plots with trees and 33 plots without, and compared the findings. For him, almost every measure was better with trees. So he got thicker egg shells, he got higher number of grade A eggs, he got less stress, less feather pecking, lower mortality, less ammonia emissions from the system. The ground was drier, so a whole range.
And the plants, do the plants benefit as well?
He wasn't measuring that. He was looking at the chickens.
Have you noticed anything with the plants at all?
Well, so there was one bit of ours where when we did have the chickens, which is almonds interplanted with raspberries. Yeah. So we mulched it all with wood chip, and then the first half of that row, the chickens was the one that the chickens tended to go to. It was nearer their house, and so they were pecking away and keeping that weed free, giving it a little bit of fertilizer. And the raspberries on that bit are 3 or 4 times the size of the bit where they were still mulched, but they didn't get that same attention. And even now, 2 years later, you can see that difference.
There's a difference between the two sets of plants.
Absolutely, yeah.
So basically, the chickens are almost being gardeners in a way. That they're eradicating competition, stopping the weeds growing, and fertilising.
Yeah. And possibly even, there may not be many pests because it was a new planting, but in a more established setting, they'll be eating insects as well. So
P&D control, pest and disease control, fertiliser, weeding, all through a chicken.
Exactly.
Brilliant.
And then you don't have to pay them to do it; they pay you to do it because you've got eggs.
So you get free eggs as well. Yeah. Well, what's not to like? If I think, obviously, you're doing it on a big scale here, in terms of obviously most people have a small urban back garden. I actually have a balcony or an allotment. I have an allotment. If you were to encourage people at home to do it, people in their own private spaces, how would you go about that in terms of agroforestry?
So I do have an allotment as well, and I am doing agroforestry on my allotment.
Tell me about that.
So effectively, you can have any tree. You could even, potentially you could call soft fruits and vegetables agroforestry. Yeah. A fruit bush is still a woody perennial in that sense. Yeah. And it's all in a way. It's all about thinking about that design. There's a lot of this does come from some of the permaculture principles. I'm not particularly a permaculture expert, but agroforestry is sometimes seen as the sort of commercial version of permaculture. So it's looking at designing your whole garden in a way that benefits it. So the way I've done it in my allotment, for instance, is I've divided it up into 6 beds, effectively. And I've got a espaliered apple tree in between each of those beds. My intention will be to keep it to about 6 foot high, so it won't get too shady, and it'll be trimmed back. So it's in a way, it's quite a small, narrow bit, but it's still getting those benefits. It's creating a bit of shade for some of the vegetables that like shade, but not so much shade that the ones that want the sun can't get it.
So in a way then, in my balcony, if I took some pots and I put some soft fruit in, and I planted maybe some lettuce around them, and I'm in a way practicing a bit of agroforestry, aren't I?
And I think, obviously getting a tree onto your balcony gets a bit harder.
Yes.
But it's that diversity. What you won't get, I guess, on the balcony. So one of the real key benefits in the larger setting is build up of that soil health and soil life. Yeah. And one of the things that's really important for soil health is the fungal populations. And the one thing that fungus hate is being disturbed. So every time you dig or in a farm, if you're ploughing, you're killing off the fungus in that soil. If you dig your whole area, then obviously you're damaging all of that. But if you've got an area under the tree which is never disturbed, then the fungus and the soil life is going to develop better. So your whole system becomes more resilient because it's more connected. And those fungus in those areas will be talking to fungus everywhere else. So you could be bringing in nutrients from fungus 2 miles away through this kind of network. I sometimes think of it as kind of like the road network system, in that you're getting something from London to Newcastle, you can go all the way through on these different roads. Well, actually, your fungal system in your gardens and all your neighbours' gardens, that all links up. So that, if you've got a good fungal, high nutrient bit of soil under your trees, it can be feeding your vegetables.
And so if you're by digging, etc., you're disturbing that fungal network, are you? You're actually breaking that up.
Absolutely.
And that fungal network also help keep a balance of pest and disease in the soil and nutrients in the soil.
And it can do. I think there's even some studies that show, I'm not sure it's fully understood how, but that shows that plants can communicate to each other through these soil networks. So if one plant is getting attacked by a pest, it sends a signal to those other plants that says, aphids over here. And so they all go, all right, okay, let's send out some tannins to stop the aphids eating us.
So that symbiosis is the word, I suppose, between the fungus and the soil is absolutely fundamental for healthy plant growth. Yeah. That's really interesting. You can do that in a small urban garden on an allotment. A bit trickier on a container garden, but you can still maybe have a mixed planting on there, a diverse planting.
You'll get some of the benefits, but you might not get all of them.
Sure. I always think of agroforestry, my time in Cameroon many years ago, and for there it was about countering soil erosion because of the slash and burn. So I take it as big benefits for soil here as well.
So soil erosion, it, both from wind and water, it can help. So it'll slow water down, it'll slow wind down, it protects the soil, builds soil organic matter, which obviously helps against erosion as well.
And what about nutrients? Does it become self-cycling? Does it become self-sufficient as well, an agroforestry crop?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that's talked about quite a lot is the way that agroforestry uses bits of the soil that smaller plants don't. So if most people I think are probably aware that what you see above ground with a plant is roughly what's below the ground. So the bigger the plant above, the more root you've got underneath. So if you're just growing grass or you're just growing wheat, you're actually only using a foot or two of the soil. If you're then growing a tree that's roots are going down 2, 3, 4 metres, then you can effectively make a better use of that soil resource that you've got. And then they're bringing those nutrients up from that soil into the leaves drop back into the soil. So all of that nutrient is being recycled and potentially is then available to your other enterprises.
Wow, so you'll get more volume then, you're more reach by doing this way. And how does, I know obviously you do a lot of work with the Soil Associations, quite close to you. Do they fit into Eastbrook? Are they a part of this setup?
Well, there's a sort of mutual beneficial relationship. So I work for the Soil Association and I also work for the farm here at Eastbrook. We do a lot of practical work. So I mentioned the handbook that we've just written, which is aimed at farmers thinking about agroforestry, but we also do quite a lot of work trying to persuade government or other bodies to support agroforestry planting. So having somewhere like this that we can bring people and demonstrate, I mean, we're not getting everything right, but we can demonstrate how it looks. And
so you kind of see this as almost a pioneer example of what other farmers can do.
Well, what they can do or what they might not want to do. We're trialling quite a lot of different species. We're trialling sort of 1 or 2 different systems.
Sure, so it's quite important work.
Yeah, and there are a number of farmers now trialling this stuff. There's a few that have been going for maybe 5-10 years. Stephen Briggs is one who's an arable and apple farmer up in Cambridgeshire. But there's a number now. There's a really interesting stuff going on at Dartington down in Devon, where they've got this multiple tenant system where they sub-rent just the roads with the trees on. You might not own a farm, but actually you could be really interested in growing tree crops.
So you could be a market gardener and lease a bit of that land, could you? And
exactly.
Yeah.
Or you could say, I want to grow apples for, I want to grow pears to make perry cider, which is what we're doing. But actually, I'll just go and rent some strips of land in someone else's farm. So you don't have to be a millionaire to become a farmer potentially. So
it's all like you can get almost like a people's movement of organic, fresh produce grown through agroforestry means, basically. Yeah. That's quite exciting, isn't it? Don't you think?
Really exciting,
and that kind of brings me to, I suppose, in a way, the organic movement as a whole. Because I suppose for us, times are changing a little bit, aren't they? We're the Soil Association and Guard Organic, quite old organisations, but we're erring into much more different things, aren't we? Into environmental, into climate change, into all these big questions, aren't we? Do you see that's where the future's going?
I think, the way I'd see it, I don't know whether you would agree with this, but the organisations that you mentioned, I think they saw some of the challenges a long time ago.
They were ahead of their time in a way.
And we were, it was a struggle often to get people to listen, but also some of those sort of real consequences of what we were doing hadn't really come home to roost, and now we're seeing some of that happening. We're seeing some real soil degradation in parts of the country. We're seeing climate change and global warming. We're seeing some of those things where you can't ignore it anymore. And actually some of the stuff that those pioneering organisations or pioneering farmers were doing, we can learn a little bit from that, how we manage or how we cope. I think a lot of people are now waking up to that, and they might not want to be organic, with a big O, but actually they're really interested in soil, they really care about soil. What we've seen is that people are really asking quite detailed questions about where their food's coming from.
So it's really, I think, an interesting time to be part of the organic movement and to be looking at things like agroforestry and diverse plantings, etc.
And I think, we need to always be questioning what we're doing. Is organic enough? Well, no, it's not. Organic is great. There's a lot of good stuff there, but there's more we can be doing. We need to be making organic better or moving,
I think as gardeners, we're always experimenting, aren't we? I don't think that ever changes, is it? You're always kind of looking and learning from other gardeners, and I think that gives us a strength, doesn't it, really? Because we are coming up with solutions by the fact we have that natural approach to things. I suppose that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I've certainly noticed in my 25 odd years in organic horticulture is that mostly people are so willing to share.
I think we are, by nature, incredibly generous, because I haven't worked a bit in TV. If you come across the chefs, they're like, you're not getting my recipe, mate. Whereas we just can't wait to tell people, can we? We are...
and I think also there's nothing to lose by not being. I could tell you everything that we're doing here, and you would go away, and even if we were after the same market, you'd do it in a different way.
You would, you can blueprint it, but also it's that idea of people when they're looking at their own spaces, their own allotments, their own back gardens, and thinking they can do stuff that's beneficial to the soil, their health, fresh food, having that kind of reach, and many, many little drops maketh a shower, eh? And that's kind of how I see it. I like the term I read when I was reading your stuff, doing my homework, if you like, of the 3D agricultural, 3D horticulture.
The Stephen Briggs I mentioned earlier, I think he talks about that quite a lot, and he's got this great saying that he says one of the issues of making agroforestry more popular, he says the people who work with trees are always looking up, and people who work with plants are always looking down, and they never meet.
I hope that people who listen to this interview and the podcast really get something of it and find out more about it. And again, brilliant to chat to you, Ben. I've really enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
And now it's time to open the podcast postbag. We've got Hannah here and Anton and Chris, of course. So, first question, Hannah, from your postbag.
Yeah, so the first one's a really common one. So someone's written in and said they've just taken on a new allotment and it's very overgrown with weeds and brambles. Very daunting. How would we recommend they go about approaching it?
I completely sympathise with this person, partly because I think it's a tradition that allotments are a certain size, and that size is really quite large, and especially if you're time poor, either through work or family commitments or whatever, it's a lot of ground to take on all at once. I think there are two things here. I think the first approach is, first of all, slash all that greenery to the ground. It's going to be bindweed, my guess, brambles, docks, dandelions, they're all going to be there. Take the greenery down to the ground. It's very satisfying, it's hard work, it'll warm you up in the February month, and put all the greenery on your new compost heap. Now, I personally would divide that allotment up. I wouldn't try and do the whole thing at once. I would probably divide it in half, say. And on one half, I'd put a very, very thick mulch, as thick as you can make it, 6 inches or more, with compost or well-rotted manure, and then cover that with either with a fabric, there's one called Mypex, which is plastic, sort of tough fabric, or cardboard, and weight that down and then leave that for at least 6 months, if not a year or so. What will happen then is that the worms underneath and the soil life underneath all this mulch will come to life and pull that mulch down into the soil, and after 6 months, a year or whatever, you will get this beautiful friable soil that's wonderfully rich, which you can pull the weeds out very, very easily. Would you agree with that?
I do indeed. In fact, I've had a similar experience as well. As you know, I took over an allotment which no one had touched for 5 years. And it is daunting. That is a good word to describe it, even for an experienced gardener like me. But what you've just described, what you do, it does work perfectly. It was a longer period for me. I did have an incredible amount of horsetail, which is a very vigorous and resists you big time.
It's tough.
And then so I used mushroom compost actually, but I chopped it off. I recommend anyone to buy a mattock, right? It's a very useful tool. It's like a pickaxe, but one end is flat and you can grub out as much as you can. So that's good, it's cheaper than the gym and you'll enjoy it in the fresh air. Get that out and then I put a nice thick layer of mushroom compost down. Then I put my Mypex, which is permeable, so it breathes, it lets the soil breathe. And I left it for 2 seasons. The first season I lifted it, I could still see there was quite a lot of roots, horsetail root in there, so I repinned it. Now it just looks, I nearly had to roll about it the other day, it looks so good. And I can put a fork through it and I can see there are no roots in it. So you can still use the allotment. I've still grown lots of stuff. I've just, as you say, the word is fallow. I've just left sections of it under the Mypex to reclaim it, and it's worked perfectly. And it's a perfectly organic, non-chemical way. And all the worms are still there, and all the health, all the microbes are still there, and I'm going to have a great time growing on that land now.
And also in the other half, or the other portion that you feel able to tackle, think also about where you're going to put paths, whether you can plant some small fruit trees. All these things will take up space and therefore reduce that large daunting area that you feel you've got to get on top of. It will reduce it down to manageable areas. And I think that's the key thing with allotments.
If compartmentalise. Maybe get a little pen and paper, do a little design on it and compartmentalise it, and then you've got it all. It will do that sort of look at it. I mean, when I first got mine, and I cleared it and I dug it over it, I looked like I could get a bus from one end to the other. They are big plots of land, so don't try and take on too much at once. It's a quite important rule, I think. Yeah.
The mulching works very well. I don't have an allotment, but I have raised beds, and I had one that was completely compacted with bindweed, and it had my raspberry canes in it. So I had to say goodbye to raspberries for 12 months. Do this idea of mulching and then covering. I used cardboard, in fact, weighted down with bricks. And it was remarkable. After a year, I could pull the bindweed out as easily as you pull a string of spaghetti out of a bowl.
And what about rotivators, Anton, when you want to clear an allotment?
Well, obviously it's a very tempting thing to do because it sort of turns the soil over and makes it look tidy just for a short time, but this will actually make the problem a lot worse. And basically you're chopping up all those perennial weed roots and multiplying up those plants. So if you've got anything like bindweed or bramble roots, you're basically making a problem 10 times worse. And also you can, especially if it's sort of wet, you will be sort of destroying the soil structure. You'll create what's called a soil pan just underneath where the sort of blades of the rotivators are pounding, and that creates a hard layer which roots find very difficult to penetrate. So I would steer clear of them.
Tempting, but at the same time to be avoided.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is asking about frost. What's the best way to protect tender perennials from frost?
Well, it depends which ones you're talking about, Hannah. I think the big sort of tender perennials we think about is maybe Dixonias, like tree ferns, these kind of really exotic plants we brought into our landscapes and we planted over the last sort of decade or so. There's a very art form to that almost. When I worked at Botanic Gardens, we would actually wrap the crowns in hessian to protect that inner crown. So you'd probably stuff it with straw, bind it with twine, and then bind it with hessian, and it looks quite strange, quite attractive in its own way. But that will stop any damp and frost getting into the crown of the plant, which will cause the damage. If you're talking about,
I've seen people use bubble wrap doing that.
Yes, you do. It's exactly the same. It's still insulin. I don't think it looks very pretty. I prefer the hessian because it's a more natural material. But hey, if you want to use bubble wrap, that's fine. It does the same job. If you stop popping all the bubbles before you get it on there, and then so that'll protect that. The other thing that maybe you might talk about is herbaceous perennials. This time of year, you've got the dead crowns on. I would never touch them until probably around late March or mid-March, because that dead sort of straw material of the original plant will protect the crowns of the plant, the roots of the plant, from any late frost or dampness. So that's probably the best way. It's a natural protection. You see it in the wild, so use it in your own garden as well.
And is it within frost, is it the cold that's the problem?
I think it's very often a combination of cold, but probably more damp actually. So yes, frost might kill the stems of the plant and certainly might kill the tender crown that Chris is talking about, but the dampness is very often the killer, especially plants that like free draining soil, perennials that like that.
Which most of them do, which is a majority of them. They will like that sort of free draining, nice loamy soil.
And the old stems from last year's flowering can look very beautiful on a frosty morning with the light catching them, and if they've got seed heads, don't forget the birds will like the seeds on the seed heads as well.
Would you collect leaves from around it? Would you pick the leaves up, Anton?
Generally it's a good idea to pick up the leaves because they can sort of let things get sort of quite moist and damp under there, but you do need to check for wildlife as well. Certainly in my garden, I've got a hedgehog nesting behind one of the plant pots, so just let that pile of leaves
Lucky
go
you.
Yeah,
sort
very
of
lucky.
undisturbed. And we've also found frogs and toads under those piles. So yeah, check what you're lifting up.
So just be careful, basically, then is the tip, is it?
Yeah.
So can we talk dahlias in particular? They're massively back in fashion now. My next door neighbour's got a beautiful display, and every Christmas or every winter he brings them into the loft. Is that necessary?
Well, I think that it's a two-way thing, isn't it, really? I want to say it's time. If you can leave your dahlias in the ground, I know there's the allotment next to me have got a lot of dahlias and they don't lift them and they look fine this year. And on my old parks days, where I worked with some amazing gardeners, they were really, really big into dahlia specialists and they spent a lot of time and energy on them. And they would lift their dahlias and they would cut the eyes down so they got new shoots and they would put them in sand trays and they would be stored somewhere cool and dry. And their argument was that means didn't spread any viruses, they were less pest and disease prone. But I think it probably worked both ways. It also depends which part of the country you live in as well. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. And I'm actually experimenting this year with not lifting my dahlias. I used to do that and lift them, put them in sand and keep them over winter and brush them down and cut them off and da-da-da-da. And this year I thought, what the hell, I'm just going to leave them and see what happens. I'll let you know, but I suspect it's not going to work. Not because of frost, but because it's been so wet. And I think they'll rot in that very heavy wet soil that we've had over this wet winter.
I can chip in that the winter before last, I didn't lift them, but put them in pots into the greenhouse just to keep them dry. And last summer I did get a pretty good display.
Good dahlias, yeah.
So it was okay, but whether I could keep doing that long term, I don't know.
So we're talking compost now. Love talking compost. Someone's written in and asked if it's okay to put brassica stumps on the compost heap. Some have very yellow leaves. Anton, what would you recommend?
Well, the yellow leaves is generally not a problem. That's just a natural process of the leaves dying off. There might be a few sort of fungal diseases on the leaves. There's alternaria leaf spot, but that actually just gets broken down in the compost, so that's not a problem. What you would want to look out for is club root on the roots.
Yeah, good point.
That is a very sort of pernicious disease. It will, once it gets into the soil, it can stick around.
You can't really grow brassicas there, can you?
No, it'll stick around for about 20 years in this soil, so you don't want to get that in. And club root, it basically looks like a lump of ginger on the bottom of your brassicas.
The roots are swollen and horribly distorted, aren't they?
And that's caused by a fungus. And that won't get broken down in your compost bin, so you really don't want to be putting that into your compost and spreading it all around your garden. You could put it out for your green waste collection, because a hot composting process, which is done in a sort of large commercial heap, that will break down the club root, but not in you can't rely on that working in your domestic compost bin. The other thing is they can be quite tough as well. They might take a long time to break down, so I would chop them up a bit first as well, otherwise you'll find you've got
You'll still be there in
lumps.
So shred them is a good idea.
Smash them with a hammer.
But the yellow leaves, nothing to worry about, right?
Yellow leaves, nothing to worry about. No.
Great. The last question, Sarah, this is yours. You've
Well,
snuck it
yes,
in.
I've snuck one in of my own, Hannah. I hope you don't mind. But I've noticed, partly because it's been such a wet winter, but my paths and edges are covered in moss, which is very beautiful but lethal. So I just wondered, guys, if I remove it, which I have done in certain areas, what would you do with it? Would you put it on the compost heap? I've left some out for the birds because I know they like building their nests from moss. But what else? What other uses do you think there is for it?
Well, I'm a big, as you know, container gardener, and that is just gold dust for hanging baskets to me.
Oh, Chris, I'll give you
Yes,
some.
you can. I'm more than happy, because I was like, it's actually quite expensive to buy, and I'm always a bit worried about the sustainability as well, where it comes from, because it's never really clear. So anything I can naturally get. In fact, I did a client's lawn last year, and I had to sprinkle. They had a very damp lawn. It was on clay, so it was full of moss. And I springbokked it, I got the lawn rake on it, and I got all my moss for the year out of that lawn, little 5 foot by 5 foot lawn. So I would definitely put it to that use. And you're right, the birds, as soon as I've got it in the baskets, I've got magpies on there stealing it all, so I need a backup.
What would you do, Anton?
Well, if let's say you didn't have a use for it for your hanging baskets, some people are worried if they put it in their compost that they're going to end up spreading moss spores around, but this isn't really a great worry. It doesn't sort of spread it around, and they do break down in the compost. I think the main worry is that it just takes a long time to break down. So you do need to add it in moderation to your compost. People say about sort of not more than about 1 in 4 of your material should be moss. So just add it gradually, perhaps have it in a big pile there, and like Chris said, just leave it out for the birds because they really like using it for their nests.
Yeah, well, I have got an awful lot of the stuff. So, Chris, there's a...
Well, there you go. I'll have a bag of that off you, no problem. Yeah.
Great. That's it. Thank you very much.
Great,
Cheers,
thank
Hannah.
you. Sadly, we've come to the end. It sounds like a busy month for us all, and we haven't even started the growing season yet. I hope you have time to enjoy those winter skies, cold frosty days, and quiet, thoughtful planning for the growing year ahead. Next month, we have the wonderful Joe Swift with us. He and Chris chat about Gardener's World, Chelsea, and how Joe first started in garden design. Do join us. Don't forget, there's loads of information on the Garden Organic website, www.gardenorganic.org.uk, about all of the topics we discussed today. And why not head over to the Organic Gardening catalogue online for all your seeds and gardening needs. And whatever the weather, I hope you feel inspired in your organic plot. Our thanks to Kevin MacLeod for providing the music.